When John Price didn't turn up for work the next morning, his co-workers feared what turned out to be far worse than absence. They feared the worst, and the truth was more horrifying than anyone dared imagine. She was born on 24 October 1955 in Tenterfield, New South Wales, the younger of a pair of twin girls in a family already bruised by scandal. Her mother, Barbara, had left her conservative small town after an affair with a man named Ken Knight, a co-worker of her then-husband, a scandal which drove the family to uproot and try to escape judgment. But the turmoil followed them. Katherine Mary Knight grew up amid instability. Her mother and stepfather shared a home with several half-siblings from Barbara's previous marriage, but their household was poisoned by violence. Ken Knight struggled with alcoholism and regularly assaulted his wife. From an early age, Katherine witnessed cruelty, learned fear, and absorbed chaos as normal. According to later psychiatric reports, her mother frequently expressed a deep contempt for men, a contempt she passed on to her daughter. Young Katherine claimed, in later life, that she had been abused by several family members, siblings included, though not her father. Her childhood lacked stability. There was little order, little safety, and even less guidance. She found solace, or perhaps a sense of control, in one place, the slaughterhouse. At 15, she dropped out of school. She never learned to read or write properly. She took a job in a clothing factory, a short stop. Soon after, she landed a position that would change her life as a meat worker in a local abattoir. She began cutting offal and slowly worked her way up, eventually becoming a boning worker. There she was given her own set of butcher's knives, knives she kept hung carefully above her bed at home. "Just in case," she reportedly said. Residents of the town later recalled how she would sometimes ominously tell people that the knives were always handy, a detail that in hindsight would freeze many in dread. As a teenager, she had a split personality. Classmates remembered that when calm, she could be pleasant, even model student-like, earning awards for good behavior. But when provoked, she became dangerous, violent, bullying smaller children, and once attacking a boy with a weapon. Her home background, abuse, fear, instability, and her growing comfort with knives and violence wove together over time. In a place where life and death were daily tasks at the abattoir, she learned to treat flesh as something to be cut, carved, handled, and that sense of power lingered beyond working hours. Through the 70s and 80s, she drifted from one relationship to another. One coworker turned husband was a heavy drinker and troubled man who attracted violence himself, and she had no hesitation stepping in, fists or knives ready whenever he fought. Their wedding day came in 1974, when she was only 19. Even then, her mother had warned the husband bluntly, if he stirred her up the wrong way, he was fucked. Domestic violence became the pattern. Her relationships were marred by rage, jealousy, assault. Multiple partners would later describe her as quick to lash out, first with threats, then with weapons. Over time, many tried to escape, some succeeded. Some had scars, others kept silent. Few pronouncements were made, few lives broken openly. Society shrugged. She was just volatile. Still, life in a small rural town went on. People came and went. The weekly visits to the local RSL club, the casual gatherings at pubs or bars. For many, Katherine was just a hard-working woman with a menacing edge. She had a job, she sometimes smiled. She existed under the radar. Never yet had she crossed the threshold into something so monstrous that anyone could fully imagine it. And then she met him, John Charles Thomas Price. A decent man, a father, a miner, a man who, by all accounts from friends and neighbors, was a good bloke. A man used to hard work, simple evenings, and a steady rhythm of life. He was nothing extraordinary, but ordinary in the most human sense. Tall maybe, earthy perhaps, calm for the most part. A man who offered stability, something she had never known. When they began living together in the 1990s, many already whispered about the risks. For Price, there was love, companionship, a fractured trust, and a stubborn hope. For her, a woman tempered by trauma, hardened by knives, and seduced by control. On the surface, the relationship looked like a second chance, but underneath, the same old currents swirled: jealousy, rage, threats. violence. Price knew enough to be afraid. Friends knew it, neighbors sensed it. But no one, not the police, not the community, not the system, stepped in decisively. Because she worked with knives, because she looked marginal, because she was a woman, and that would turn out to be the tragic miscalculation. But on the night of 28 February 2000, everything changed. When John Price walked out of his workplace on the afternoon of February 29, 2000, he looked tired. Not physically, but in the way a man looks when he has been carrying something heavy in silence for too long. His co-workers watched him pack up his things, and there was a moment, a quiet one, where he seemed to hesitate near the door, as if some instinct deep inside him was begging him to stay, to not go home, to break the cycle just this once. But he didn't. He never did. He had told them many times, in half-joking tones that were not jokes at all, that if he didn't show up one morning, they would know why. He said Katherine would get him first. And still, he went home. It was a warm, late summer evening in Aberdeen, the type of night where the sound of insects hums against the distant thrum of the mines and the quiet residential streets feel deceptively peaceful. Price spent some time with neighbors, chatting outside as people do in small towns where everyone knows at least a few pages of everyone else's story. He laughed a little, tried to appear relaxed, but underneath that faint, tired smile was a dread that had become familiar. The restraining order still sat in place. The wound on his chest, where she had stabbed him days earlier, was still healing. And yet he had gone back to her. The cycle had reset, the danger had returned, and the people around him understood the pattern too well to say much more. They warned him. They pleaded with him, but he had children to worry about, and Katherine knew that. She knew exactly which buttons to press. Around 11 p.m. he returned home. The house was oddly quiet. Her car wasn't there. The children weren't there either. She had sent them to stay elsewhere, claiming it was a treat, a night off, a bit of fun. Price didn't question it, but later investigators would mark that detail as the first unmistakable red flag that something had been decided in her mind long before he arrived. Inside the house, nothing seemed out of place at first. Price walked through the rooms with the slow, heavy gait of a man preparing himself for whatever mood he might find her in. But she wasn't home. He went to bed, perhaps relieved, perhaps uneasy, lying on his back and staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the town settling into sleep. The hours crawled forward. Midnight passed. Then somewhere around that time, Katherine returned. She walked into the house with an eerie sense of calm, as if she were following steps she had rehearsed 1,000 times. She showered. She watched television for a short while. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual to an outside observer, but her quietness, her purpose, would later stand out as chilling. She moved through the home with the meticulous stillness of a predator preparing for the moment when instinct takes over. Then she went upstairs. Price was asleep, or half asleep, or pretending to be. She crawled into bed beside him. She woke him gently. They had intercourse. It was an act loaded with contradictions, intimacy mixed with dread, closeness mixed with an undercurrent of something darker. Later analysis would suggest this might have been a final ritual in her mind, a symbolic closing of a chapter she had no intention of allowing him to escape. Afterward, Price rolled over and drifted back to sleep. Sometime between then and the early hours of the morning, everything changed. The house fell silent. Outside, the night was still. Inside, she moved with the knives she kept above her bed, knives she had cleaned, sharpened, cherished, tools of her trade, tools she knew intimately. Just after 6 a.m., the first sign that something was wrong came from outside, where a neighbor noticed Price's car still sitting in the driveway. The lights in the house remained off. It was unusual. It was unsettling. Price was reliable, painfully so, according to the people closest to him. If he wasn't at work, something was wrong. A co-worker and the neighbor approached the house and knocked on his bedroom window, calling his name, trying to wake him, assuming he had overslept. But the house gave no response. The stillness grew heavier. They stepped back, puzzled, then circled around to the front door. That was when they saw it. Small at first, almost easy to dismiss if one wanted to, a faint smear of blood on the front door. That was the moment fear crystallized. They didn't enter. They didn't shout again. They backed away, breath caught in their throats. Price's earlier warnings about what she might do suddenly echoed with new weight, and the two men made the call that would begin the unraveling of the nightmare. When police arrived, they didn't waste time knocking. The back door was kicked open. The air inside the house was thick, stagnant, unnervingly still. Officers stepped into the dark hallway, calling out, their voices careful and low, echoing slightly in the narrow space. What they found inside would haunt every officer present for decades to come. But before they reached the horror waiting in the next room, they saw her first. Katherine Knight lay on the floor, unconscious, pills scattered around her like discarded evidence of a half-hearted suicide attempt. Her body was still warm. She wasn't dead. She wasn't dying. She was simply waiting, deep in a chemical fog. It was almost peaceful, almost ordinary, except nothing else in the room was, because only a short distance away, they found what remained of John Price. But that discovery, the brutality, the staggering violence, the forensic details that defied belief, would not fully reveal their horror until investigators traced the trail of blood backward, following the story of his last desperate moments. It was clear from the first glance that Price had not died in his sleep. He had been attacked, violently, ferociously, with wounds that told a story not just of murder but of pursuit. Blood marks led from the bedroom to the hallway to the small path near the front door. Investigators would later speculate he woke during the attack, that he tried to flee, that he made it halfway out the door before collapsing. He tried to escape her. He tried to survive. But she chased him. She dragged him. Or he crawled. No one could say for sure. But the pattern of the wounds made one thing clear: he fought for his life. And then, when the house went quiet again and Price lay dead in the hallway, the night shifted into something no one could have expected. Because the violence that came after death was not impulsive, not frantic. It was deliberate, methodical, skilled. The mark of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering knives and anatomy. And when detectives turned the corner into the kitchen, into the dining room, into the living room, they realized that what had happened after Price's death was even worse than the hours that came before. That was when they found the skin, the head, the meat hooks, the stove, the plates, the name cards. But the details, the ones that would shake Australia to its core, were still waiting in the next room. And investigators were about to find something that changed everything. The first officer through the doorway froze. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't fear in the usual sense. It was the human mind, confronted with something so far outside the bounds of what it expects to see, trying to rearrange itself fast enough to understand. The air inside the house was cold, unnaturally still, carrying a heavy metallic smell that clung to the back of the throat. In the dim morning light, shapes blurred into each other, only sharpening as the officers stepped farther down the hallway. At first, they registered the overturned furniture, the splatters on the walls, the drag marks on the floor. Then, slowly, they registered the scene in front of them. John Price's headless and skinless body lay arranged on the floor as if posed. One arm draped over an empty soda bottle, his legs crossed neatly at the ankles, like someone had tried to make the dead appear relaxed. But there was nothing relaxed about it. Not the positioning, not the brutality, not the smell. It was as if a nightmare had been frozen mid-frame, waiting for someone else to walk in and bear witness. One officer whispered, almost under his breath, "Dear God." Another turned away suddenly, swallowing hard, trying not to gag. But the training kicked in. They moved carefully, methodically, stepping around blood, noting details, calling out their observations with steady voices that hid the shock trembling beneath every syllable. The blood evidence painted a story. Thick trails of it showed where Price had tried to escape, running from the bedroom into the hallway. Spatter patterns along the walls suggested wild, desperate movement. His, not hers, because every arc, every drip, every trail showed a man fighting for his life. Officers followed the streaks to the front door, where smeared prints showed where he had tried to pull it open. Whether he collapsed or she dragged him back inside would never be definitively known. But one thing was clear: he had not died easily. He had not died quickly. In the kitchen, the investigation shifted from horror to disbelief. On the stove sat a large pot. The lid was still on. Steam no longer rose from it, but the stench hovering around it suggested it had been boiling not long before police arrived. When an officer lifted the lid, even the most experienced investigators recoiled. Inside the pot, submerged in cloudy water mixed with vegetables, was Price's head. His face, though discolored and distorted, was unmistakable. The officers had found decapitations before, yes, but nothing like this. Nothing prepared them for a human head simmering in a stew pot, as if it were part of a grotesque domestic ritual. Near the pot, 2 prepared plates sat neatly on the dining table, each arranged with cooked meat, slices cut from Price's buttocks, served with potatoes, pumpkin, beets, cabbage, and gravy. Next to each plate sat a small note card. On those cards were the names of Price's children. Officers stared at them, numb, unable to reconcile the domestic neatness of the table with the nightmarish violence surrounding it. One plate, investigators noted, was found later discarded in the backyard, flung onto the grass as if someone had lost their nerve at the last moment. The living room held something even more surreal. Hanging from the top of the doorway, stretched out almost like a grotesque curtain, was John Price's entire skin, flayed with precision, removed in one intact sheet, except for a small rectangle of flesh left on his chest from an earlier stab wound she had inflicted weeks before. The skin hung from a meat hook, swaying gently in the draft created by officers moving through the room. Even hardened veterans felt their stomachs twist at the sight. The level of skill required to remove skin so cleanly was staggering. And then they remembered where Knight had worked for decades. The slaughterhouse. The knives she loved. The way she used to brag about her ability to carve with expert precision. It all made sense now in the worst possible way. In the bedroom, they found her knives still arranged on the wall above the bed where she had always kept them. Tools laid out like trophies, polished, ready. They were part of her identity, part of her control, part of her madness, and now part of the evidence. As forensic specialists arrived, the investigation deepened. Bloodstain analysts studied every mark, every splash, mapping out the final minutes of Price's life. They determined he had been stabbed at least 37 times, front and back, wounds that varied in depth and direction, consistent with someone attacking in a frenzy or a state of dissociated rage. The pattern suggested she had first stabbed him while he lay sleeping or just waking. Then, as he fled, she continued the assault, following him through the house. Forensic psychologists were brought in early, not because they were needed for the legal case. The evidence was overwhelming, but because investigators needed to understand what they were looking at. Crimes of passion exist. Sadistic murders exist. Revenge killings exist. But what Knight had done did not fit neatly into any one category. It was extreme, theatrical, symbolic, almost ritualistic. The psychologists began constructing a profile. They noted her history of intense jealousy, her violent outbursts, her obsessiveness, her need for control, her lifelong comfort with knives, and her early exposure to trauma and violence. But one feature stood out above the rest: the post-mortem mutilation. Skinning, decapitation, cooking of body parts. These acts suggested a type of deeply embedded rage, a desire to dominate completely, to obliterate identity, to rewrite the narrative of the relationship on her terms alone. One expert quietly used the phrase, predatory violence. Another mentioned psychopathic traits. Another pointed out the possibility of a dissociative episode, though the planning involved sending the children away, preparing the table, arranging the body, indicated clarity rather than confusion. As detectives pieced together the timeline, they noticed that Knight's actions after the murder were oddly methodical. After killing Price, she had showered, cleaned herself, and then began the mutilation. The level of skill indicated familiarity, almost professional competence. What she did next, however, moved beyond skill into something darker. She wrote a note, a rambling accusation scrawled in blood and bits of flesh. The words were childlike, misspelled, but dripping with anger. She accused Price of harming her daughter, accusations investigators quickly dismissed as baseless. It appeared she wanted to justify her actions, to create a narrative in which she was exacting revenge rather than indulging in the monstrous violence she had long been capable of. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Katherine lay unconscious but stable, the empty pill bottle beside her suggesting an attempt to take her own life. But the dosage was inconsistent with a genuine suicide attempt. Paramedics noted she had not taken enough to cause real damage. Psychologists later suggested it may have been theatrical, an attempt to appear remorseful or mentally unstable before she could be questioned. When she eventually woke, she claimed to remember nothing. Not the argument, not the stabbing, not the skinning, not the cooking, not the note. Nothing. Her face remained blank. She denied everything, even as investigators showed her the overwhelming evidence. They were met with the same calm tone every time. "I don't remember. I can't recall. I wasn't myself." But the evidence did not need her memory. It told the story with brutal clarity. As the investigation widened, detectives interviewed former partners. Each painted a chilling portrait: jealousy, rage, threats, knives, strangulation attempts, assaults. The pattern was unmistakable. Knight's violence had been escalating for decades, but every time she crossed a line, someone patched things over, someone justified her behavior, someone excused the violence as temper, as stress, as something she'd get over. But she never did. She only got worse. And now, with John Price dead and his home turned into something out of a horror film, officers realized the truth. This wasn't a sudden snap. This wasn't a moment of madness. This was the inevitable conclusion of a long, violent road that no one had dared to confront. But the darkest truth, the one that investigators would only fully face in the months to come, was that the justice system had never encountered a woman like Katherine Knight before. A woman capable of violence as extreme as the most notorious male offenders. A woman who defied expectations at every turn. And the truth of what she had done, the full weight of her brutality, would become even clearer when her trial began. A trial that would take a turn no one saw coming. When Katherine Knight finally opened her eyes in the hospital, the world around her was already irrevocably changed. The police had finished combing through the house. The forensic teams had done their work. The photographs, the measurements, the autopsy, the statements, everything was ready. Her fate was already sealed long before she woke. She blinked slowly, looked around the sterile room, and when detectives approached her bedside, she stared at them with an expression that was almost childlike, almost blank. She claimed she remembered nothing. She asked no questions. She offered no apologies. If she felt horror at what she had done, she didn't show it. If she understood the magnitude of her actions, there was no sign. And as detectives watched her face, they realized something chilling. This might not be an act, or worse, it might be one. When she was discharged from the hospital, she was immediately arrested for the murder of John Price. Her demeanor remained flat, controlled, calm. She didn't cry when she was told the charges. She didn't protest. She simply blinked, nodded, and repeated her claim that she could remember nothing of that night. Nothing before, nothing after, nothing at all. The court process began, slow at first, then rapidly accelerating as the mountain of evidence grew. Prosecutors prepared one of the most disturbing cases Australia had ever seen. They had crime scene photographs so graphic the judge later offered the jury the option to step down before viewing them. They had forensic reports detailing the sequence of injuries. They had psychological evaluations, character statements, testimonies from former partners who described years, decades of violence. And at the center of it all was her, Katherine Mary Knight. A woman who had terrorized those closest to her for most of her adult life. A woman who learned early that violence could silence anyone. A woman who had finally gone so far that even the most lenient excuses collapsed under the weight of truth. Her defense team initially floated the idea of diminished responsibility, that perhaps she suffered from a dissociative disorder, that perhaps she had acted in a state of uncontrollable rage, detached from reality. But the planning, the preparations, the deliberate sending away of the children, the methodical nature of the mutilation, all pointed in the opposite direction. This was not a sudden snap. This was a trajectory, a progression of violence culminating in something meticulously brutal. On February 2, 2001, she appeared in court for arraignment and entered a plea of not guilty. The trial was scheduled for July, then delayed to October due to illness. Meanwhile, the jury pool grew anxious. Reporters circled, the public whispered. The town of Aberdeen braced itself. The story was everywhere, not just because of the violence, but because a woman had committed it. The idea shook people. It challenged assumptions about what women were capable of. It forced society to reconsider long-held beliefs about domestic violence and gender. And in the middle of that storm, Knight sat quietly, her face unreadable. On the first real day of the trial, something unexpected happened. The judge dismissed the jury for the afternoon. When court resumed the next morning, Knight abruptly changed her plea to guilty. No explanation, no warning, no emotion, just one word: guilty. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Her lawyers were stunned, prosecutors were stunned. Even the judge paused, visibly taken aback. It meant there would be no testimony, no jury, no need for the graphic photographs to be shown. It meant she accepted full legal responsibility for what she had done. But as the weeks unfolded, it became clear she didn't actually accept anything. She simply removed the need for a trial. Some believed it was a final act of control. If she pleaded guilty, she could deny the details. She could hide behind her claim of amnesia. She could prevent her children from hearing the gruesome evidence. She could avoid the parade of witnesses who knew her too well. She could silence her former partners who would have testified about her pattern of violence. Others believed the evidence was simply overwhelming and there was no point in fighting. But the timing, the sudden shift, the lack of explanation, suggested something more cunning. She couldn't bear the idea of the world dissecting her. So she ended the dissection before it could begin. Even after pleading guilty, she asked to leave the courtroom during the sentencing because she did not want to hear the details of the crime read aloud. The judge refused. She sat there, rigid, arms crossed tightly over her chest, jaw clenched. When prosecutors described the skinning, she broke down and began screaming, thrashing, sobbing uncontrollably, forcing officers to restrain her until she could be sedated. It was the only time she showed any visible emotion. And even then, it wasn't remorse. It was discomfort. She couldn't stand hearing the truth spoken back to her. The sentencing took place on November 8, 2001. The courtroom was silent as Justice Barry O'Keefe delivered one of the most severe judgments in Australian legal history. He called the crime appalling, almost beyond contemplation, and so horrific that it demands the most extreme penalty the law can provide. He noted her long history of violence, her lack of remorse, her dangerousness. Then he sentenced her to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He ordered that her file be marked with the words, "Never to be released," no second chance, no hope of release, no possibility of redemption through time. She became the first woman in Australian history to receive such a sentence. She appealed, of course. She claimed the sentence was too severe. The appellate court took little time to dismiss it. They upheld the sentence unanimously, stating that her crime was clearly one of the very worst to come before the courts. To the public, the story became a symbol for something much larger than one horrific murder. People debated how she had been allowed to escalate for so long, how so many violent acts had been minimized, ignored, dismissed as temper or jealousy, how former partners had reported abuse but remained unsupported, how police had been called but no serious intervention was made, how a restraining order had not been enough. The case raised uncomfortable questions about how domestic violence is handled, particularly when the perpetrator is a woman and society is conditioned to view women as victims rather than aggressors. For many experts, Katherine Knight represented a rare but real category, a female perpetrator of extreme violence, driven not by desperation or defense, but by domination, cruelty, and control. She did not fit the stereotypical profile of female offenders. She didn't kill out of fear or self-protection. She killed out of rage and the need to possess completely. The mutilation reflected not madness, but mastery. The tools, the technique, the precision were learned over years in the abattoir. Her violence was part of her identity, woven into her relationships, normalized by those who called her temper. Just Katherine being Katherine. And John Price became the victim of everything society refused to see. His children grew up without their father. They lived with the scars left by the woman who had pretended to care for them. They lived with the knowledge that their names had been written on those plates. They lived with the understanding that the system meant to protect them had failed long before their father died. His friends and co-workers carried the burden of knowing he had warned them, and they could not stop what came next. The town of Aberdeen still remembers the night the sirens wailed before dawn. Many never spoke about what they saw. Some never will. Katherine Knight now sits in Silverwater Correctional Center, nearly 70 years old, still claiming she cannot remember the night she destroyed a man who had once loved her. Inmates describe her as quiet, controlled, polite. She works, she reads, she passes time. But in the eyes of the law, and in the memory of those who survived her, she remains one of the most dangerous and violent offenders Australia has ever known. And the moral of her story, the lesson carved painfully into the nation's memory, is this: violence does not come with a predictable face. Danger does not always look like the stereotype. Abuse can escalate silently when no one believes the victim could possibly fear the one who harms them. And the greatest warning sign is often the one everyone ignores, the pattern that people normalize until it becomes a catastrophe. If someone shows you who they are in moments of anger, believe them. If violence becomes routine, it will only grow. And when people say they are afraid, listen. Because ignoring those fears cost John Price his life, and society cannot afford to make that mistake again.